Good afternoon. My name is Karis Cummings, and I am doing my presentation on agrarianism. Um, so to start off, American agrarianism is, according to Springerlink, agrarianism is an ethical perspective that privileges an agriculturally oriented political economy. At its most concise, agrarianism is the idea that agriculture and those occupations involving agriculture are especially important and valuable element of society. So this type of society opposes industrial society movement because they feel like it is not as effective. So some history behind agrarianism is specifically Southern agrarianism is thought to be the culture of the Old South. It was the traditional way of living before large industries and was drilled into the culture of living off the land. Agricultural work, such as being a farmer, was thought to be noble work. One had to be self-reliant and orderly. Pre-Civil War in the South was when farmers and agriculture here in the U.S. was at its peak. After the Civil War and the loss of slaves, farming began to decline. In the early 20th century, there was a rise in industries, making the farming not as, quote, important. There was, like, the loss of slaves. There were people that would pay for people to help them on their farms, but a lot of people couldn't afford that. So it became less and less common as the years went on. In perspective, as we talked about in class, less than 2% of the American population is made up of farmers here today. In the early 1900s, industries started to boom and making society move away from farming and into industrial work. So specifically in the North in the early 20th century, there was a big industrial movement that made factories and all types of sorts. And in the South, that slowly started to trickle down, but even still, we were losing farming. Industrial work was faster and more efficient than the previous agricultural work. You could get your stuff faster, and that was hard for farmers because it takes time for things to grow. The older Southerners specifically did not like the idea of moving into industrial work. Unlike the younger generations, farmers didn't believe that faster was better. There were some things that we did need for industries, but also living off the land had worked for years in their minds. As industries continued to grow, it began to be harder and harder for the agricultural community to stay afloat. So we read Jayber Crow, and in Jayber Crow, Wendell Berry had two characters named Athie Keith and Troy Chatham. These two were on the very different sides of the spectrum within Wendell Berry's story Jayber Crow. So the relationship between Athie Keith and Troy Chatham shows the true fall of agrarianism and moving into industrial society. Wendell Berry uses these two characters to show how society is changing from one generation to the next in order to prove that agrarianism was better than what was to come. So in Wendell Berry's perspective, within Jayber Crow, he highlights agrarianism versus industrialism. He obviously felt that agrarianism was better, showing by the effects of its death. So from one generation to the other, Athie Keith was Troy Chatham's father-in-law. Troy Chatham ends up marrying Maddie Keith, who turns into Maddie Chatham. So Athie Keith was a large landowner who grew his own crops. He never made more than what he could afford or handle. He kept his land in great shape. He believed in hard manual work. He did not take shortcuts to get a bigger supply, and he grew enough to support his family, and that was it. So whether it was selling, it was enough to sell and support his family and the small community that he lived in. As for Troy Chatham, he believed that he could make more and make it faster using new technology. So he was a big believer in expanding crops within Athy Keith's land, because Athy Keith only used part of his land. He did not use all of it. He bought new supplies and more things for the land to expand production. He used credit to get the things that he needed and paid them off later, so he was in debt. He believed that debt made him seem more important. He also believed that debt, every important person has debt, so he thought that that made him more important, and he grew as much as possible, even if it was too much to handle, because it made him more money. Athy Keith was a respectable man who had old South values. When Troy came into his daughter's life, Athy didn't like him very much at first, never really did in the end either. Athy began to teach Troy the way around the farm, teaching him how to use the land, how much to plant, etc. Him and Troy butted heads. Troy did not believe that he should plant less. He wanted to plant more, use the entire farmland instead of using just a piece of it or a fraction of it. Athy knew that the more land he used, the more work, the more money it would cost. In the end, the ends didn't reach the means in Athy's mind. Athy eventually moved off the large piece of land to give it to Matty Chatham, and moved to a smaller piece of land that he could tend to in his old age, and let Troy tend to the larger land that was owned to the Keith family. Troy Chatham was married to Matty Chatham, and he wanted to take over the land and make it his own. Once Kathy and Della died, or moved to a smaller land, Troy started utilizing more of the land and brought new equipment and stuff like that. Once they died, he did whatever he wanted. He bought all the equipment using credit and paying it back every year, so all the money that he was making, most of it had to go back to his debts. He worked long and unbearable hours day in and day out. He worked late through the night. He always spoke of how busy he was. He believed that debt made him better and a more successful person, because successful people have debt nowadays, as he would claim. He ended up running the land to the ground. He tore down the trees and the beautiful lands that the Keiths had once owned in order to make more money to pay his debts, and he would just accumulate more debt. He was so deep in debts that he was never able to stop nor slow down. So this shows agrarianism in the way that Athy is the example of true agrarianism, working in agriculture and knowing the value of his hard work and the land and not taking advantage of it, while Troy is the example of moving more into the industrial lifestyle. Though Troy is still working on the farm, in his ways it's more industrial than what his father-in-law Athy had. He wanted to make it into more of an industry and try to make the big bucks instead of just focusing on his family and the small town that he lived in. He wanted to change the way things were done, and Troy believed quantity over quality, and Athy believed the opposite of quality over quantity for his family. So in Jayber Crow, it shows that the fall of one generation into the next was the death of the Keith family. In my opinion, when Athy died, that was one big step for Troy to take over the land in the way that he saw was best. But the death of Della was when Troy had full control over the Keith land, because Matty wasn't going to tell him any different. And right when Matty started to get seriously ill and started to get sick was when Troy cut down all the trees and used the entire land as farmland. And it didn't work out in his favor in the end, and Troy shows how the death of agrarianism into industrialism had an effect on the land, on the family, on the small town, etc. It was really hard, and Wendell shows that agrarianism was better in his point of view through the story in his book. It seemed like he favored agrarianism over industrialism, and Troy was not a very popular character. So, in the end, it shows the end of agrarian way of life. And here's my source.